As I mentioned, I have been teaching in China for 7 years. 2 years as a university professor, teaching environmental economics to graduate students at a university in Nanjing, China, as well as 5 years teaching elite high school students destined for Western universities, and teaching them first-year university courses from the US about environmental science and human geography. And human geography is basically cultural geography. So for 5 years, I had in-depth discussions with my high school students about Chinese culture, Western culture, religion, language, ethnicity, even politics. And so I developed a really in-depth understanding of China. And I had similar, often similar type conversations with my graduate students at university too. And so for each of those 7 years, I traveled back to Toronto, Canada, my hometown, and I was constantly really focused on comparing the two cultures. So Canadian culture in Toronto and Chinese culture in the Chinese city I was living in at the time, whatever city it was. And so I really spent these 7 years consciously and in depth comparing the two cultures and civilizations. And so through this conscious awareness, I've developed a deep understanding of China that I never hear talked about in the Western press, like literally never. I have been reading the New York Times almost the entire period I was in China. Any article related to China I read, and I never saw it. I also read the English daily newspaper called China Daily for a couple of years while I was teaching human geography. So I basically had the perspective of China, largely the Communist Party of China, and the perspective of the New York Times, the leading newspaper in the West. And so anyway, so when I returned last time to Toronto for a visit during Spring Festival, that was on the brink of the outbreak of the coronavirus. And so the subsequent lockdowns and so on made me think that maybe it was time that I should start writing that book that my friends had been urging I write for the last several years, because they had heard so many interesting stories from me. And so I thought, okay, maybe this is a good time to do that. So I went on the internet just to get a sense of the information out there. And I discovered these four prominent authors, or four prominent voices on China. Two of them were authors, had written books. One had done a film or video, and one had done a TED Talk. So first, the authors. One is Martin Jock, who is a professor from the United Kingdom, and he's written a really in-depth book about the called When China Rules the World. And so it's very in-depth about Chinese culture and history, and it goes into Western history too, and tries to predict what is going to happen in the future as China rises, because we're going to have a superpower that is from a different culture and speaks a totally different language and is a developing country. There's so many differences about China becoming a leader in the world. And so that was one book I read, and the big theme in that is really how, I think mainly is how little the West knows and understands China compared to China's understanding of the West. So this is where I felt my voice could fit in terms of educating people in the West about China. Then there is another book called The China Mirage by James Bradley, an American author. And it's really about the relationship between the US and China over history, really, I guess, since Washington. And so a big theme in that book is how little the US has understood China over decades, and that this has been a contributing factor to the wars in that part of the world near China, Vietnam, for instance, and that it's resulted in the deaths of upwards of 200,000 American soldiers, partially as a result of this lack of knowledge. So to give you an example, he talks about periods in American history where there wasn't a single person in the State Department who knew Chinese. So how can you understand China if fully, as a leader in America, if you don't know Chinese? How can you communicate? And so those are the books, and then there's a well-known video called The Coming War on China. And that's by John Pilger, who's a UK investigative journalist. And so his whole argument is that America has been preparing for war with China for decades by building up naval bases in the Pacific to contain China as China rises and gets stronger. And so he talks about potential for war. So you've got one writer saying war has occurred as a result of misinformation, and then you've got another saying the potential for war in the future and plans that have been made for war. And also, I think it does not deny a lack of knowledge of China. And then the final one is a well-known TED Talk by former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who talks about the indications of China and the US heading towards war, but that it doesn't have to happen, and that what we need to do is open up a dialogue between China and the West, and between Chinese people and people from the West, to get a discussion going, just to share and learn from each other, to try and prevent misunderstanding from creating problems in the future. So that's where I suddenly realized that's where I fit in. So I started with the idea of just writing a book on China and my experiences, but learning all this information about the potential for war and maybe the need for a dialogue, I thought I'm really well placed to get involved in this. So I want to bring my knowledge of having lived for 7 years in China, teaching and interacting with Chinese people in an intensive way, and what I learned from that. And so by sharing this other way of looking at China, I'm quite sure it's going to change your thinking about China. So in January of 2013 is when I first moved to Nanjing, China, to be a professor for a couple of years. And I found people were treating me so well, I actually was a little bit suspicious about it, because I just couldn't believe people would treat me this well for no reason. I always would think, well, surely they want something from me. But over the years, I had to accept that, no, I think this was legitimate. This is legitimate. I lived in a few different cities. I traveled all over China. I've been to multiple provinces, met all different types of people, all walks of life, and it's been a consistent message that kindness is what I've gotten from all this. Of course, not every single person is, but overwhelmingly, it's hard not to leave China without that feeling about Chinese culture. And so I finally had to accept that maybe they really are that kind. And anyway, so we figured out my need for speaking out about China. Then in this particular video, I want to focus on a famous person in Chinese history to kind of kick off this YouTube channel, and his name is Xuanzang. And I think he's an excellent example because he was a Buddhist monk 1400 years ago, and he's famous for making a trip to the West, at least for China in those days. So specifically to India, to get more scriptures to learn more about Buddhism, which had already migrated to China along the Silk Road. And but the problem was there were conflicts, there'd be debates between different monks about different aspects of Buddhism, and he was frustrated by that. So he grew up near Xi'an, China, which is the Chinese end of the Silk Road, the major Silk Road. There's actually multiple routes that are part of what we call the Silk Road. And so he'd had debates with other Buddhist scholars about Buddhist thinking and had trouble resolving them because he just felt he didn't have all the knowledge. So he wanted to go to India, where Buddhism came from, where the Buddha lived, and get scriptures, learn under a master, and get a whole bunch of scriptures and bring them back to China and translate them into Chinese so that these conflicts could be resolved. And so that was his dream. So he actually became a Buddhist monk, and he was in about his late 20s when he decided he wanted to go to India. And so he applied to get a permit to leave Xi'an, but he was rejected a few times. And finally he said, I don't care. This is my life's work. He was very passionate about this. I want to go. So he left illegally. And so what this meant, he had to be very careful as he traveled so that he wouldn't be caught by officials of the Tang dynasty or any of the multiple countries he traveled through. I believe it was something like 132 countries he traveled to. And we're talking about a 25,000 kilometer journey over a 16-year period. So this is like Marco Polo level kind of expedition and journey to India. So huge. And so basically he had to travel at night to avoid capture, and he had to take a long route there to find the safest way to get there, which really meant going west, right to the west of China, and then heading south down to India, because cutting, the Himalayas was basically the big landform that he had to walk around and to get there. And so this is a great epic journey. And so he went to India and he studied under a master in Bodh Gaya, which is the birthplace of Buddhism. It's where Buddha experienced enlightenment. And so that's in northeastern India. And then he also traveled around India, and he became quite a master himself after all those years. It took about 3 to 4 years to get there. He was in India for, must have been around a decade, 10 years, and then it must have been a couple years for him to return. Now he was worried about the emperor because he had left illegally, causing trouble if he returned to China. So he rode ahead, but everything seemed to be okay with the emperor. The emperor was dying for him to come back because he had been away for so long. He had learned so much about the outside world. He would be very useful as a source of information about the outside world to the emperor of the Tang dynasty. And so he made his way back to China and basically became responsible for spreading Buddhism throughout China. But the first thing he did, or the main thing he did, was really translate all the scriptures that were in Sanskrit into Mandarin. So it could be spread, not Mandarin, but into Chinese, at least at the time, and so that it could be spread around China. And so that's what he spent the rest of his life doing. And Xi'an at the time was probably the biggest city in the world. And so it was definitely a prominent place. So, but by the time he died, he was born in about 602 and died I think about 67 years later, so maybe 669. And so in his funeral, there was as many as 1 million people attending his funeral. That's how famous he was, because he was bringing wisdom back from the outside world to China. China just had Confucianism and had Taoism, and Buddhism was the third sort of major source of wisdom in China. And so this is probably the greatest foreign import into China that has influenced China throughout history. This is why I love Xuanzang. I identify with him, connecting different civilizations. He's was very famous historically, and he's still famous to this day because his story has been translated in fairy tale form into a book called Journey to the West that is very famous today. All children learn this story. And so you see characters from that story to the present day in China. So very relevant, and it's considered one of the 5 classics of China. And so anyway, I didn't know anything about Xuanzang until I saw a series on by a BBC series called Story of China. And in that series, they talk about narrator Michael Wood describes Xuanzang as a member of one culture who had lovingly and totally immersed himself in another. So that's how I identify with Xuanzang, because I feel I have done something similar. I arrived as kind of a blank slate with little preconceptions of China, few preconceptions. And then after 7 years of interacting, traveling around China and interacting with students, became transformed as I learned a lot more about Chinese culture and history. Okay, I just wanted to show you a little PowerPoint presentation to elaborate a bit on Xuanzang to give you a clearer picture of what he did. So this is about Xuanzang's journey to the West, and it was between 629 and 645, so a 16-year journey. So to India, around India, and back to China, and including studying in India. And this was all to bring fundamentals of Buddhism to China. There'd already been Buddhism in China and Buddhist monks, but they didn't have all the scriptures. And so that was really his main goal. And then also just to train under masters in Buddhism. So over time, so this is what this quote is about, it took about 500 years when by the time Xuanzang's real-life adventures gave birth to some of China's greatest fairy tales. So 500 years after Xuanzang, his journeys were written up in a fairy tale form by a writer, and that since has become very prevalent, very well known in China, the journey to the West. And this slide is just to show modern China and where he started out from, to give you a sense of where he started from. And I'll just highlight it. The place is modern day Xi'an, right here in yellow. So that's where the terracotta warriors are. And in the past, historically, it was called Chang'an. And so at the time, it was literally, I think, the biggest city in the world. And this was also the Chinese end of the Silk Road. So there's all sorts of mixing and diversity, diverse cultures mixing in this area, and possibly the most diverse place on the planet at the time. So this is a time when China was quite open to the world through trade along the Silk Road. And here's a well-known painting of Xuanzang. showing his huge backpack that he carried with him that I believe was made of bamboo. And if you look carefully, at least the upper reaches of the backpack, you can see lots of scrolls. So that's representing the Buddhist sutras that were brought back to China. So to help him resolve some of these conflicts between monks about interpretation of Buddhism. And the other prominent thing is you can see that lamp that's hanging in front of his face. That's so he can travel at night because it was illegal what he did, leaving Xi'an without a permit to go and visit India. Okay, and this is a really nice map that shows the whole journey that Xuanzang made and where he went in particular, like the different cities. And so first, you can see down below in the key, Xuanzang was born in 1602 and died in 664. So he's 62 years old when he died, and 16 years of that 64, so that's a quarter of his life, was spent traveling to India, learning more about Buddhism, and then bringing the sutras back and his wisdom back to China, Xi'an, China. So he did that from 629 to 645. So that red is his journey on the way there. And that, it took about 3 years for him to reach northwestern India. And he set out, and you can see the different, I'll just talk about a couple of the cities. So at the extreme east end, you can see Luoyang on the blue marking. And so that was his hometown. That's where he was born. And then Chang'an is actually the ancient name for Xi'an. So basically that's Xi'an, and then he went north there following the red, and then, and then north, and then west, and then south. And then he crossed, he got into India on the northwest side, and he crossed over to the northeast side because that is where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And so let's see if I can mark that out for you. Bodh Gaya. So right there, Bodh Gaya. So that's where he spent most of his time studying under a master of Buddhism, and and starting to collect the different sutras. And so I think it was roughly maybe 10 years in India. And so he traveled all around and visited sites that the Buddha had visited. So he really wanted to totally immerse himself in the culture and learn all about Buddhism. And he actually competed in a debate about Buddhism, and he won the debate. So he actually became a very prominent figure in India itself. But over time, like this is significant, especially significant because over time Buddhism kind of died out in India and came to China. So in the present day, most Buddhists in the world are from China. And so Buddhism basically migrated to China, and largely because Xuanzang was a large part of that. And so anyway, so I just wanted to show the whole journey about Xuanzang because I really identify with him. He immersed himself in another culture. He took the wisdom from that culture, brought it back to his own, China. And so Buddhism is probably the greatest foreign import into China and has been there for such a long time. It's just part of Chinese culture. So Buddhism has kind of mixed with Taoism and Confucianism and, form part of Chinese culture. So I myself see that maybe I'm doing something similar. I'm coming from the West, though, to the East, and then now trying to bring back some of that knowledge from the East back to the West to help bridge this gap in understanding that seems to be occurring between China and the rest of the world, especially the Western world. And so that's one part, is that I really identify with him. He also represents a great link between the East and the West. And the third thing is that even though it was 1400 years ago, it's still, his story is still told in fairy tale form to children. and it's everywhere too. Like I witnessed it myself, as I said, in plays and books and films and movies and video games. It's still deeply embedded in the culture. So anyway, so he's a great figure, I think, to start off with. And anyway, this is just the beginning of my channel. And, I have lots of different stories I plan to talk about over time that'll be more kind of personalized of what happened to me. But I would certainly welcome any comments or anything that might help me improve the site, or just tell me what you think so far. I know it's just at the beginning, but I'd be interested to hear. Thank you.